Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Spectrum and Users, What You Need to Know About the Path to Fixed LTE webinar presented by Telrad Networks. My name is Dory Aran of iOpening Marketing, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. We would like to hear from you today, so ask questions and share comments. Use the question and answer panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player to share at any time during the webinar. We will have a couple of poll questions during the webinar as well. Those will pop up right on your screen. We'll give you a few seconds to answer each and share the results. We will also have time for questions at the end. Today's presenter is Tom Gruba, who has over 30 years of experience in telecommunications in various capacities, including engineering, product management, sales, and marketing. Many of Tom's accomplishments surfaced as he served as Director of Marketing in Alcatel-Lucent's Wireless Infrastructure Division, as Head of Product Marketing at Motorola, and as CMO of the successful Canopy broadband wireless startup. Also presenting today is Steve Coran of the firm Lerman Center. Steve is the chairman of the firm's broadband practice group and serves on its management committee. His practice focuses on the representation of broadband providers and equipment and technology companies, serving their policy, compliance, and licensing needs. He actively represents a trade association before the FCC, Congress, and other federal agencies. We also hope to have Nick Dewar joining us in a couple of minutes. He's the Vice President of Systems Engineering and Business Development for Telrad Networks. While not presenting today, he has a wealth of LTE knowledge and will help us answer any product and technical questions that arise. We're proud to have all of them with us today, and without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Tom Gruba.
Thank you very much, Dory, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope you can get a lot out of today's session, so don't be shy about raising your hand and asking questions. Today, what we're going to cover is what you see here on the agenda. What's changing in the market? Why is managed spectrum or licensed spectrum essential to success in these days and times? What's the latest with CBRS? And thankfully, we've got Steve on with us to give us the latest. And a question that a lot of people have in terms of what they know about other wireless technologies is LTE affordable? And not only is it affordable in low density, low ARPU markets? And spoiler alert, given that I've got it as an agenda item, the answer is yes. Moving on, we're going to talk at the beginning on some of my favorite topics. It's what's going on with the spectrum, what are users doing, and what do we think they're going to do, and what are the applications that are important to them. So before I get into all of these game changers that we'll go through, we have 3 polls today that Dory mentioned, and we're going to start off with a poll that'll just take you a minute. Would really appreciate your input because it gives us guidance as we move forward. So Dory?
Yep, sorry about that. I was just answering a couple questions that were coming in.
Oh, certainly.
So here's the first poll. You should be seeing that on your screen. Where are you in the process of evaluating fixed LTE for your network? Select one of the following: determining the business case, investigating LTE technology, evaluating LTE vendors, looking to try it, or other.
That's great, guys. Thank you very much for adding to the poll. We've got 75% of you that have voted, so if we can get that a little bit higher, we greatly appreciate it. It's always good guidance to understand what everyone's thinking about and what's on top of mind.
So I will give that a few more seconds. And I'm going to close the poll now. So, Tom, what we have is determining the business case, 13%, investigating LTE technology, 15%, evaluating LTE vendors, 19%, looking to try it, 21%, and other, 32%.
Very good. So I think today's presentation will help people in all of those categories. So if you have a question that we didn't cover, then please answer, or please ask it. So today, the user habits and expectations has changed a lot over the last 10 to 15 years. That's not a surprise to people. But the next bullet is, unlicensed spectrum being used by tier 1 mobile operators is a big change. 20 years ago, they would not have considered for a minute using unlicensed spectrum. It had too much risk. There were too many unknowns. It was not insurable. But these days, given the consumption by end users, they'll use any means possible to deliver data. Another big game changer is that when you talk about delivering broadband, you have to have spectrum to do it. And so the opening up of the CBRS band that's about to hit the scene is going to be important to the success of operators as they continue to deploy fixed wireless products around the US, especially those areas where you have unserved and underserved. There's a very important frequency for that. LTE products in the fixed wireless market, for those of you that, that don't know, LTE's been around in testing in the beginning since 2007, but it's only because of Telrad in 2015 that the first LTE products came to fixed wireless. Now, there were other products being used. There were mobile systems being used in a fixed application, but we're the first company that actually has developed products specifically for the fixed broadband market, and we'll cover some of that. I added a bullet this month that is also about 5G, because we get a lot of questions about 5G and what and how should I consider the impact of 5G. So we'll talk about that. So first and foremost, what's happening with users? If I look at today, you've got a lot of streaming devices that exist that didn't exist 20 years ago. And as a result, you have a lot of people that are cutting the cord. In 2010, you'll see the stat, the 4.5% of households cut the cord and went straight to streaming. And in 2016, that number went to 22%, which represents 27 million households. And that continues to rise. In addition to that, what you find is the quality of video continues to rise. And so you've gone from SD to HD, and what is here, and not in great numbers, but it's here and will have an impact on those broadband networks, is 4K. And just as an example, if you look at Amazon's requirements or Netflix requirements for video, they're thinking between 15 and 25 megabits per stream. So you can imagine the kind of impact that that's going to have. And if you look at the requirement to deliver 4K, 21% of census blocks have no access to a 25 megabit per second service. So that's what we're starting with. The second is that you look at how people live. Multiple streams are now common. So I have stories from operators that say, the husband or wife will call up and say, I'm not getting the service, as you promised, it's not fast enough, it's not working right. And through deep packet inspection, the technicians can determine that there are two people, typically the children, that are streaming video from each of their bedrooms. When you ask the parents, they said, no one's doing any video. So that just tells you how easy and accessible it is and the impact of having multiple streams per home. In addition, one of the horror stories that I have come to find was, if you look at how people have previously lived with cable, you'd turn on a TV and you'd leave it on in a room. Some people would leave it on in 2 rooms or 3 rooms. And there was one household that the broadband operator could not understand how one home could be consuming that many gigabytes per month. And when they went to the house, they had to find out what was going on. They walked in the door and there was a TV on to the left, the one to the right. And when the nice woman took them in for iced tea into the kitchen, there was a TV on there. And if they were all on a streaming service that wasn't cable. So a big challenge for you as operators is to help people understand that it's not a broadcast service, that it's actually a streaming service. So this creates, again, many challenges for you as operators, which means that the impact on you and your network is as follows. So if we look at hosting one stream, so the first row, and if you're offering a package at 15 megabits, average consumption per home today, rough and tough, and Nick can go through the math if you need to, is about 2.5 megabits per second. At a sector capacity using 20 megahertz, the number of homes that you can support with oversubscription is 40 or so. But 40 is a very conservative number, but just use it as the example here. And let's say that your subscription price was $50. Then the cost per home and that's what I was really after here, is about 2.5% per home. If you look at having multiple streams, even if you're offering a higher level package, the impact on your business is that the consumption is outpacing the subscription price. And so if you look at the bottom line there, you could be running 3 streams on a 25 meg service. They're consuming 7.5 megabits in that case. Your sector capacity with less, your subscription price is $75 a month, but they're consuming 7.5% of your asset. So the trend is that average consumption per household is on the rise. The impact is, as you can imagine, you're delivering more bits and not getting any more money. And so that's a big problem. And it creates 2 problems. So let's talk about those 2 problems. Number 1, the first question is, can you get users to pay more? And I've got to tell you that we use the terms best effort. Most people don't know that they're on a best effort service, and they don't know what best effort means. In fact, I myself have a 15 meg service into my house, and it works great for doing Netflix. I rarely get the little wheel that spins, but the problem I have is that I use a lot of cloud-based applications like Outlook 365 or Microsoft 365, Office 365, and latency is a problem for me. I'll be typing away in Word and the letters don't show up right away. So users don't understand what they're doing in most cases. They understand what they're doing, but they don't understand the impact of how much speed is important. So why do I get 15 meg versus 100 meg, and would 100 megs change my service? And the answer to that is I do not believe that it would. So users do understand and value streaming services. I'm streaming my video, I'm streaming my music, I can do multiple streams simultaneously, and I've got low latency, especially if they're a gamer or people like me that are using a lot of cloud-based apps. So this provides an opportunity, and I'm just bringing as a suggestion because I've talked to some operators that have done this, but it's an opportunity to reposition your offerings. And so if you look at it, the user may understand, I want to buy a service that supports 3 streams, and you can price it accordingly, and you don't have to try to help them understand I need a 25 meg service or a 50 meg service. This may be especially important for those of you operators that are in a competitive environment, meaning a cable environment or competing against DSL. If you look at someone that can offer a 100 meg service, you may not be able to do that marketing, and users have become fixated on more is better. 100 meg is better than 50 meg, when that isn't the case, right? Based on the applications you're running, 100 meg might not provide you any value. So the opportunity to actually look and market the number of streams that user wants might be an alternative way for you to compete with the cable company and figure out what that user is willing to pay. And given the consumption, you might be able to right size the pricing in line with what the offer is. Just something to consider. The last bullet really talks about that problem will probably get worse. And so factoring in the level that user will have. Are they streaming SD, HD, or are they out in a rural area and want to get 4K? So I think some of that education can be things you put on a website to help people understand and set their expectations. Problem 2 is then from a technical side, where you look at how do I quickly and flexibly increase network capacity to keep up with that demand. So there's a lot of ways that people increase capacity. You can add cell sites, you can add additional spectrum, but in a lot of cases, if your equipment is not a software-defined radio, you may have to roll a truck and actually replace the equipment, which is not flexible, it's not inexpensive, and it's certainly not quick. So things we'll talk about later is the value of having and looking at a software-defined radio where you can add capacity through software features. So the mechanisms for keeping up with that demand, right? We talked about software-defined radio, but the second is you have to have the software roadmap that goes with it. So be looking for a vendor that not only has the tool, the hardware, but they've got the software roadmap that can add the features, add the capacity for what you need in your market. The second bullet there is when you're making the precision on an LTE radio, LTE starts with a baseline of 2 antennas. And so you'll see it as 2 transmit, 2 receive. That's a two antenna radio. Telrad starts with a 4x4 radio. And the reason we do it is because it's a better investment for the operator to actually start with start with a 4x4 radio. We will price it in those low density markets, for those of you in those low density markets, as a 2x2 radio, and lets you software key up to 4x4. So 4x4 has more flexibility and capacity than the 2x2, which you will certainly need in the future, but you can install it once and have that capability. So it's a really nice tool for your business model. The second bullet there, is that it's a wideband radio. And so the wideband radio means that I can tune anywhere in the band. So I have flexibility and I've got investment protection. The example I use with my college age kids is if you get in a car and you tune your FM dial, you want to dial from one end of the band to the other end of the band and being able to pick up stations. And you wouldn't buy a radio that only tunes to part of the band. So in our case, what Telrad is doing is providing a radio that's very tunable, and that's going to become more and more important as we talk about CBRS, and Steve and I will go into that in a few slides. So tunable across the band of your choice. When we look at it, that could be something like 3.5 all the way up to 3.7. So that's 200 megahertz, and there's there's in the works additional spectrum that's being worked on that Steve will talk about, down at 3.4 up to 3.8, even 4 gig. The next bullet there is really. Yep.
There was a question real quick on that 4 radio. Is there an advantage to having a 4T4R radio when your CPE can only utilize 2T2R? Telrad only supports TM4.
Great question. So Nick, I'm sure you'll like to jump in on that one.
Yeah, sure. The benefits are things such as multi-user MIMO. Even though you have a 2RX subscriber unit, with the introduction of ME-MIMO, which is coming a little bit later this year, you can actually multiplex 2 of those 2 received subscribers into 4 streams total, and that translates to doubling the spectral efficiency from a 5 to a 10 bits per hertz.
Yeah, so what Nick said for the business guys on the phone is, yes, there is advantage to it. And when he talked about going from spectral efficiency, LTE as a standard is like Wi-Fi as a standard. If you go to buy a Wi-Fi router off the shelf at Best Buy, you buy an N router and it's going to do 54 megabits. LTE is the same. It's 5.5 bits per hertz until you get to things like multi-user MIMO, which double that to get you to 10 bits per hertz, right? So that's the spectral efficiency, which is a workhorse because it essentially, I should say theoretically, doubles your capacity. You will not get double, but you will get a gain. So that was a great question. Thank you very much for asking that.
I have a couple more if you have a sec for it. Does it have 2 carrier aggregation or 4 carrier aggregation? With CBRS, we may have just 10 megahertz channels.
Yeah, so Nick, you want to go ahead?
That we have 2 carrier aggregation. Whether the key is with CBRS, you can also request 20 megahertz. So whether you have contiguous 10s or 2 sets of contiguous 10s, ultimately the total bandwidth capability is 40 megahertz. Whether that be comprised of 2 sets of contiguous 10s or 2 20s.
Okay.
Another question, Dory?
Yep.
Good. I love the question.
When will Telrad upgrade to TM9?
That's definitely a Nick question. And I'm wondering.
I lost the window there. With TM8 is what's coming out first. That's our multi-user MIMO. TM9 will be sometime near behind that.
And whoever asked that question, I really like to know the why that's important. And if the timing is important, then help us understand why. We take all those types of inputs as ways to judge our roadmap. So the roadmap's to serve you as operators. And so understanding what's on your mind and why is very important. So please go ahead and you can always send a note to me, tom.gruba@telrad.com. And if you've got interest in things like TM9 or multi-user MIMO, tell me what your environment is and what your situation is that's driving that, what is behind it, because that could be you could be the first into a market where that's going to become increasingly important, and that's the kind of stuff that we need as input into the roadmap.
Okay, and
Any
there
other
was one more question about that TM9. Someone wants to know, what is TM9?
TM9 is it's a hybrid solution with multi-user MIMO and single-user MIMO, and basically dynamic switching between the two with the use of dual-layer beamforming and MIMO techniques.
So for the business guys on the phone, TM stands for transmit mode. And what Nick was talking about is you're using two methods. One is called multi-user MIMO, and the other is single-user MIMO, and they blend those. And so they're adaptive and they're dynamic, meaning that they can work to the situation at hand.
Okay, and one last one.
Yep.
When will the MU MIMO be available?
We'll be doing some controlled trials throughout the summer. I expect late Q3 that will enter into formal beta process. It will be general availability sometime in Q4, but trial opportunities will be available sooner than that.
Yeah, and that's another good one for those of you that are looking at deploying MU MIMO. We'd love to talk to you about the situation that you're in and how your network's laid out because of the ways that MU MIMO works. And so the more information we get, the more accurately we can understand how much benefit you'll get out of it. The second bullet of the second bullet says wideband radio. And so the Telrad radio can serve 40 megahertz of spectrum at once. So when Nick was talking about carrier aggregation, we can take two 20 megahertz chunks. They do not have to be contiguous. They can be anywhere in the band. And we combine them to make it 40 megahertz, which gives you higher throughput speeds. So understanding it's not just the tunability of the radio, how much of the spectrum, where can it tune, but also how much spectrum can it serve at once. And in our case, it's 40 megahertz. So as you're looking at buying products and technology, look at how much of serviceable bandwidth it has. Selecting the right, going to the third bullet, selecting the right spectrum to reduce or eliminate your interference problems is an important consideration, especially for LTE. And so that's why LTE, the products we sell are at 2.5 and at 3.65, 3.5 today, because what is happening is the noise floor is rising, and I've got a separate slide that talks about that. But in effect, interference, or what you'll hear Nick talk about, SINAR, signal to noise, as that gets worse and worse, it robs the system of capacity, and you've got users going the opposite way with their SD, HD, 4K video at multiple streams per house. So you can see where your capacity problem can get worse, which is why with us, what we look at is adding LTE to a system if you already have it. You've got a line of sight system already, you've got capacity, but now with LTE, you get non-line of sight and you get the protection of having either licensed or managed spectrum. So that's where those the two in combination, unlicensed plus licensed, can be a very winning combination. The third and final is that you look at your plan and try to figure out how much additional spectrum will you need, because there's multiple ways to add capacity. Some of them are software tools, but there's nothing that beats getting additional spectrum. And so having your spectrum plans for your business environment, it's good to start looking at, if you're starting with 20, when will you need 40? And if you've got 40, when would you need 60, and so on and so forth. It just makes sense to plan before you get too far down the path. If you look at Telrad's capacity features, so carrier aggregation, we talked a little bit about that, requires a software update. So definitely a way to help you increase your maximum speed. Multi-user MIMO, which Nick talked about from a couple different instances. It takes you from spectral efficiency, as I described, from 5 bits to 10 bits per hertz. Then dual sector is another feature that we have, which is very powerful when you go to deploy radios in an area. And let's just use the situation that you're in a rural environment. Having those 4 antennas means that I can create 2 sectors with 1 radio, and I can serve 1 sector to the west, for example, and 1 sector to the east, do it with 1 radio, especially if I'm testing a new market or if I've got a low density of users and I need to be able to do it cost effectively. So that is a feature that doesn't increase your speeds, but it does improve the area that you can cover with one radio. And then of course, as you grow, you continually add radios or software capability to increase your capacity and your coverage area.
Tom, regarding that carrier aggregation, we have a question. If you have non-contiguous channels such as a 10 megahertz wide and a 15 megahertz wide channel, can they be utilized or aggregated?
They cannot. They need to be of the same bandwidth, so 210s, 220s, 215s, 25s. That's generally a limitation of many of the CPEs on the market as well.
Oh, very good. Very good. Okay, so now we're moving into, is there any more questions, Dory? Were you okay there?
I don't think so, but I think it's time for our second poll, isn't it?
Yeah, perfect. Let's do that.
Okay, so let me launch that right now. What is holding you back from making the move to fixed LTE? You're not sure there's a business case. Acquiring spectrum will kill your business case. You don't know which vendor to choose, or you're not sure what value fixed LTE brings to your business.
Very good. We've just passed the 25% voted stage. And I think the last one, we at least got over 80% voted, did the poll.
Oh, we did. Yeah, I think it was at 85 when it ended.
Oh, super. And we won't hit 100 because I know we end up with Telrad folks on and some other folks that would keep the number below 100, but as close as we can. We've got almost 60% of you voting. So if I can encourage a few more of you to get us to 75%, that would be awesome. And maybe that's because we don't have none of these above, which is always a.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give that just a few more seconds. And I'm going to close it now.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, so we have 9% for not sure there's a business case, 27% for acquiring spectrum will kill the business case, 40% for don't know which vendor to choose, and 24% not sure what value it brings to the business.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go through there. So what's going on with spectrum? So today's challenge with spectrum is that more and more companies require it in the type of business they're in. Being wireless is a very efficient means of productivity and connectivity. And of course, being connected is what it's all about. The problem with unlicensed spectrum is that noise floor rise that we talked about. That means that the signal to noise gets worse. In an unlicensed band like 5 gigahertz, you get to areas where everybody's trying to use it. The noise floor goes up and it makes it almost unusable. Or you have to be very close to the antenna, so it's not as usable as far. So that's one of the things that people often overlook. It's still usable, but you've got to be that much closer to the antenna, which means I've got to put out more cell sites to do my coverage, and then the business case can fall apart. The demand changed. When I was young, the people that used spectrum were TV, radio, military, and those of us that were ham radio operators. Now you've got all these different players, even electric utilities. They want to have wireless to get IP connectivity out to the substation. There's the Internet of Things that is coming on strong, where people are looking at connecting billions of devices, which is why 5G has become so important. It's because the number of connections that can be maintained. That's one of the reasons. So lots of different reasons why the demand is creating scarcity, which if I tell you one thing that you need to do now, if you're an operator or considering being an operator, I encourage you to look at what options are available to you for licensed spectrum, because unlicensed spectrum you can use. But as your business case, look at who you're going to serve. If you're serving businesses, a lot of times you'll get more money from a business because you'll offer a service level agreement, and therefore you owe it to yourself to go look and determine what is that spectrum going to cost me and how do I acquire it. From an unlicensed standpoint, the pressure is being created because of things like LTEU, meaning unlicensed, LTE LAA, license assisted access, and then multi-fire. So more and more operators, the mobile operators, are looking at being able to use a licensed band to do signaling, and then the payload, the downlink, is what they're using for capacity additions, and they're using 5 gigahertz. So you look at that, the noise floor rises, reduces capacity, injects risk into your business case. And then people will ask me, but not in rural, right? I said, well, it depends on how you define rural. Where my uncles were, they had farms, so that was pretty rural. So yeah, you're safe there. However, I grew up in a rural town in Illinois that was 35,000, and to the big mobile operators, that's a significant market. So understanding where you are and how the noise floor rise will impact you is important to your business case, and those are some of the discussions that we can entertain and have with you. Looking at reducing the business case, the thing that people may or may not realize is this demand for speed and capacity drives radio manufacturers to implement the latest technology. Take one is 256 QAM. But the problem is you may be paying more money for a radio that does more speed, but as the noise floor rises, it will never reach 256 QAM. So think about it as my second bullet there. It's like driving up a mountain. You know, you start out in 5th or 6th gear, these days, I guess 8th gear, but as you go up, you're going to continually downshift. And so you'll never get the top end speed out of it. You'll get up the mountain, but you have to downshift. Modulation schemes are no different. And another example I like to use is people at a party. If two of us are in a room and we're the only two, the first ones to the party, I can talk very, very fast and I can talk across the room and you can hear me and understand me just fine. But everybody's had that experience of getting to a party where it's very crowded and then you can't hear even the person next to you, or you can't hear very well, and you get down to one word, beer, yes or no. So it operates the same way. So looking at licensed spectrum is a business imperative. So determine the risk in your area and then investigate, and we have people that can help with this. So if you need or don't have spectrum, you need spectrum. We have people that are 2.5 gigahertz brokers. We know people that have 3.65 licenses. So you want to do that before someone else comes and crowds you out. So I'm going to go into the license and managed spectrum, and this is where I bring Steve and his expertise in. So Steve, I'll go ahead and let you cover the whole slide.
Great, thanks Tom, and thanks Dory and the folks at Telrad. Always a pleasure to jump on these webinars and hopefully contribute something to the ecosystem and the industry. So let's cover a couple of the bands. The 2.5 gigahertz band covers about 190 megahertz of spectrum from 2.5 all the way up to about 2.7. And most of the spectrum is held by Sprint in the form of leases with educators. There's also spectrum that they own. This is spectrum that's licensed in many cases in a 35-mile radius from a center point that gives exclusive rights to about 22.5 megahertz of spectrum per license. As noted on the slide, the benefits are provides predictable capacity. You can offer SLAs to business customers with confidence, and you can also pay over time. You can essentially finance use of the spectrum over the term of a lease instead of paying it in one lump sum to the FCC. Not a lot of this spectrum is available, and in recent weeks, Sprint has indicated that it's getting back into the spectrum acquisition game, which means that contention for available spectrum is going to be a little hotter and may drive the prices up a little bit, but you still may be able to find some gems out there. And I know a number of folks, wireless ISPs, that were lucky enough and at the right place at the right time to acquire some of that spectrum and have deployed the Telrad LTE product with good results. The hot topic, the shiny new toy of the spectrum portfolio, is the 3 gigahertz citizens broadband radio service that is from 3550 to 3560 megahertz on your dial, way above the FM dial that Tom was talking about. This sits right below the 3.65 to 3.7 that many ISPs, wireless ISPs, are using today to provide service. And as Tom alluded to, the radios that are being made for that band and are being deployed in that band will be tunable to use in the lower band when it becomes available. We're expecting general authorized access to be available. That's sort of like unlicensed, but more of a license by rule type regulatory scheme to be available later this year. The priority access licenses, which are the 10 megahertz protected spectrum that will be available in up to 70 megahertz of that band. That is undergoing review at the FCC in terms of the areas that the FCC will make available, whether it be small areas or large areas, whether there will be short terms or long terms, and whether those terms will be renewable. All of those things are under active discussion among stakeholders in anticipation of the FCC putting some rules out probably mid-year. The benefit of an industry solution is that it will be probably better than one that the regulator would force on us. So new spectrum discussions. 3.7 to 3.8 is part of a larger mid-band proceeding that covers the 3.7 to 4.2 bands, as well as 59.25 to 71.25. There is a proposal on the table that would take the 3.7 to 3.8, that 100 megahertz, and attach it to the lower band, in essence creating a continuous band from 3550 all the way up to 3.8. 3800. Reason being is that 3600 to 3800 includes band LTE band 43. The 3.4 to 3.5 gigahertz band is something that the NTIA, which is part of the Department of Commerce, is reviewing. It's currently used by the military, but not in a way that would suggest that it is being heavily used or that those users can't be worked around in some of the dynamic sharing ways that are that will be used in CBRS. So a longer time frame on that. But the 3.7 to 3.8 and the 3.7 to 4.2 bands, we should expect to see some activity on that mid-year. So that's kind of what's going on in the 2.5 and also the 3 gig and 4 gigahertz bands as we sit here today.
Thank you, Steve. Just a question for you. So given that T-Mobile and CTIA, put in to use the band for 5G, there's been a lot of discussion and writing to people and meeting with FCC and others. Can you give anyone an update on kind of where that process is?
Sure. So the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, which I represent, WISPA, has been actively discussing with a lot of different stakeholders what the rules should look like for priority access licensing. In other words, the 70 megahertz in the CBRS band. It's a very sensitive topic at this particular time with discussions under real-time active discussion as we speak. I don't know how it's going to end up. One thing that WISPA has been very firm about since day one is allowing licensing by census tract in rural areas. Now, defining rural areas and urban areas is not an easy task if you want to do it scientifically. The feeling is that the mobile community wants spectrum for capacity in urban areas primarily. Wireless ISPs would prefer to have coverage in rural areas primarily. Cable interests would sort of like county-based licensing. So you kind of have a lot of different things out there, and trying to find a least common denominator that everybody can live with has proved to be a challenge, but I'm always optimistic that we'll be able to do something that satisfies all the business needs. It doesn't need to be a zero-sum solution that only the mobile providers can come out ahead on, and the FCC recognizes that, and it's something that WISPA is spending a large amount of time and effort on.
Steve, there is a question. I think you might have somewhat answered this with your last comments, but the question was, when you say activity, do you mean added to the CBRS band, or will we see rule finalization and licenses available?
We should see rules finalized sometime mid-year. We should have general authorized access available by the end of the year once the FCC completes testing of the system that's going to allow spectrum access, called the Spectrum Access System, and equipment certifications. In terms of auctioning off the priority access licenses, the FCC has a number of other auctions that it has teed up before then. So I don't think we will be seeing those auctions until the end of 2019 or in 2020, just given what the FCC's, number one, what their auction schedule is, and number two, the FCC is preparing to relocate to another building across town sometime in 2019 or 2020, and probably doesn't want to have an auction while that process is ongoing. So that's kind of my latest best guess as to when we will have the priority access licenses available. But in the meantime, GAA, this license by rule spectrum that will be available across the entire 150 megahertz, might give folks a real good opportunity to see how that works for them.
So there was a question regarding that. Can you explain the tiers of the licenses?
Sure. There's three different access tiers. The first one is the incumbent access tier. That's military installations at fixed locations across the country, mostly Army bases. There's also naval military. The problem with the Navy is that they don't stay in one place at one time along the coast, so you have to design kind of a new way of protecting them. The other thing is they really don't like people to know in advance where they're going to be looking for bad guys and pinging with their radar along the coast. The third thing you have is you have some fixed satellite earth stations. The benefit there is that they're fixed and they don't move around, but they are entitled to protection. So that's the incumbent tier. They're always entitled to protection. The middle tier is priority access licenses. That will be available only between 3550 and 3650 in 10 megahertz chunks and only 70 megahertz, and no company can have more than 40 megahertz of that priority access licensing. PALs, as they're called, must protect the incumbents, but do enjoy interference protection over GAA, which we'll be able to use in the top 50 megahertz from 3650 to 3700, in 30 megahertz below that, and opportunistically when and where a priority access license is not operating.
So Steve, you could buy PAL licenses and still use GAA together, correct?
That is correct, yes. And we expect that a lot of folks will do exactly that. Some may decide to use 40 megahertz of GAA spectrum in the short term and then acquire priority access licenses for 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those when the auction happens.
Very good. So for those of you that are looking at spectrum and deploying an LTE service, the nice thing is a standard, as Nick said earlier, but I don't know if you caught it, is that LTE does 5.5 bits per hertz. So if you got 20 megahertz of spectrum, that is going to be 100 megabits per second, basically, is the size that you're working with. So if you increase your spectrum to 40, then you're going to be at 5 bits per hertz. You're going to be at 200 megabits per second. So the math is pretty easy and straightforward to understand how spectrum will impact your business. So using PAL and GAA, depending on where you are, could be a good approach. So
a couple more questions.
Oh, very good.
What do you mean by 3.65 licenses that exist?
So the FCC has allowed licensing in the 3650 to 3700 megahertz band since 2008, and there are it's a registration process for all of your fixed locations. There are tens of thousands of these registered with the FCC, and deployment can continue so long as you have a license. The FCC put a freeze on new licenses in April of 2015. But as Tom alluded to earlier, there is a secondary market for those if you want to acquire one now in advance of being able to deploy under general authorized access in the entire 150 megahertz when that band opens up.
And what I heard, just to give people a reference point, is people have found them on eBay, the 365 licenses, and the going rate has been between $5,000 and $6,000. And they're national licenses, so my understanding is you can use it anywhere.
Anywhere, yes, it's a nationwide non-exclusive license, so you can get the license for anywhere, but you register at individual locations.
Perfect. We good, Dory?
We're good.
All right. So I've moved to the slide that talks about spectrum cost. And I know for a lot of people, 27% of you, you're worried, will it kill my business case? This is an example I got out of a consulting firm called Wireless 2020. This is what I would call a worst case scenario. If you look at what I've circled at 2.5 gigahertz, you would be paying $1 per megahertz pop. And pop is population. So forget the pop for now and just talk about it from $1 per megahertz. So if you were picking up 10 megahertz of 2.5 spectrum and you're a mobile operator, you'd expect to pay $10 per megahertz for that spectrum, and then given the population, it multiplies. However, what I want you to focus in on, at fixed, it's 35 cents. And the 35 cents is something that is the high side of the market. I have spoken to operators in markets that many of you would either want to serve or probably you're serving, where the price has been in the teens. So 13, 14 cents per megahertz pop. So there's a wide variety depending on where you are and how much that spectrum is valued by the person that has it. So as Steve talked about, you could have educational institutions where you could be doing a service for the community and they're willing to give it to you at a very good rate. And there's other places where there's a lot of competition, you could expect to pay, up to this 35 cents. If you contrast that with what we expect for PAL licenses in the CBRS band, obviously GAA doesn't cost anything, but if you're going to bid, my question to the firm Wireless 2020 was, what would you expect that auction to be, worst case? And 30 cents per megahertz pop. And if you look at the difference between the 30 cents compared to a 2.5, 35 cents, you say, well, why is it 5 cent difference? Because 2.5 is a lower band than 3.65, and therefore your performance would be better, which means the spectrum's a little bit more valuable. Now, what will PAL licenses go for? We don't know yet, but it gives you some logic on what could it be worth. And again, 30 cents could be on the high side, depending on where you are and how much competition there would be. Hopefully that provides a little bit of guidance in terms of what people are doing. I'm sensitive to the time, so I'm going to roll through some of these. The point of reducing business risk at using CBRS is to have what I've drawn in the picture here, or actually Nick drew, a radio that will support the entire band. So you see here, it goes from 3.55 to 3.7. Our radio is actually capable of doing much wider than that, but for this example of CBRS, we have it shown here. And carrier aggregation, this is what I mean by non-contiguous carriers. You could have one 10 megahertz block at the very bottom of the band. You could have another one all the way at the top of the band. We're going to aggregate those together and make it look like one. So why fixed LTE? So this gets to the people that are looking at not sure what value LTE brings to your business equation. So number one, just as a simple baseline, for those of you that are WISPs, you already know this. This is a report that was commissioned by WISPA in 2017. It's available at the website if you want the detail. I've summarized it here. The ARPU range, you're looking at people, 70% of them, the respondents are getting over $40. And if I look at people paying over $60, 27% of that 69% are getting over $60 a month. Churn is minimal. Subscriber acquisition costs are relatively low. Growth is very good at greater than 11% average amongst the population. And so the point is, it's a very healthy business. And if you're serving customers that don't have other options, they're customers for life unless something bad happens in their life and they've got to drop the service. So here is the slide that I like because it talks about the 10 reasons why you want to consider fixed LTE. If you take the top box, it's the business generation. So non-line of sight really means more share per tower. In some cases, you don't have any other options. So a non-line of sight technology is what you're going to need. In other instances, it's actually going to increase the market share per tower because you may have some line of sight customers and some non-line of sight customers. So at the end of the day, from a business perspective, it reduces your cost per sub per tower. The ability to offer service level agreements. So if you've got business customers, this is where you want to use a license band, and you want to be able to provide them a guaranteed service. So they're going to pay you more, and having a technology like LTE in a license band is going to give you the ability to sleep at night. So if you look at why Telrad, is that we have developed all of the software required for those business services, for you to offer business services to your customers. So when they want to do things like VPN, or they want to avoid double natting, there's a whole list of things that Nick can tell you about. We had to write those from scratch because the LTE technology is a layer 3 technology. It's integrated at the cell phone device. But what you need to serve those business customers that have multiple locations is layer 2, right? The bridging capability. So a lot of good reasons why when you do vendor selection, what you're looking for goes beyond the radio. I'm going to drop down to the bottom part here, which is about business protection. So LTE as a standard drives forward a capacity roadmap. It's not the decision of Telrad how to do those features. It's the decision of Telrad of when to do those features, and the spec has already been written. So you're in the pool with all of the other mobile operators who are starving for capacity. That's what the roadmap is driven by. If you're looking to reduce risk, lots of manufacturers, because you have standards, then you look for interoperability, but it's going to give you choice. And if one vendor has a problem or isn't going the direction you want, you're not going to go out of business because you've got to change that to your entire network. A couple other key points: carrier grade reliability and performance, and then you're going to have a lot more options in terms of CPE because of the manufacturers that have product for you. I think we covered this well enough, so I'm going to skip over it. It'll be in the, we always put these webinars up on YouTube, so you can come back and look at that in detail. But something that has come to the forefront in a lot of discussions is LTE is a non-line of sight technology. And Nick, you may want to jump in here after I give a quick explanation for any carry on. But LTE deploys differently. It's a non-line of sight technology. It makes use of OFDM-A, which is the third bullet, and not OFDM. So it's an advancement on OFDM. And what that means is multiple users, right? Multiple user version of OFDM. LTE, the reason it's able to provide non-line of sight capability at the frequencies it does is because it relies on reflections, which is multipath, to be able to get the signal and be able to provide a connection when you're in that non-line of sight environment. That's why LTE starts with 2 antennas and builds up from there. So what I find is people have a bad experience with it because they're trying to set it up like they did a Wi-Fi based system or some proprietary system. So to avoid the bad experience, learn the LTE fundamentals before deploying. Talk to our guys like Nick and his team to really help understand what it looks like to make sure you have a good experience. Nick, anything to add to that?
No, you're on target there, Tom. Basically, the OFDMA technique it will allow for simultaneous scheduling and dynamic scheduling of users versus OFDM. A lot of vendors will implement proprietary TDMA mechanisms on top of OFDM in order to account for the fact that they're trying to service simultaneously multiple users. In general, it's inefficient to do so, and certainly not as dynamic as the OFDMA technique.
Yeah, and as long as we're on the topic, something else for those of you out there is, if you're comparing latency, if latency is important, if you take a Wi-Fi based system and a lot of tests that will use 1 CPE, hands down Wi-Fi will win. It'll have the lowest latency. But as you put users on the system, the way that works, latency increases across the board. LTE, the way it's structured, will give you consistent latency from user 1 all the way up to user 50. So you get a consistent user experience throughout your sector. Did I get that right, Nick?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
We have a couple questions, Tom.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, Telrad products in the 5.x gigahertz compact 1000 radio. Is there an availability date?
We will introduce a 5 gigahertz product this year. We actually have a slightly different form factor. It's called the Breeze U100. It can optionally be purchased with an integrated 5 gigahertz antenna or purchased with connectorized. That product will be introduced in late 2018, probably close to Q4.
Okay, also, what is the best tower height?
It really depends on the frequency for one, but as a rule of thumb, we will state that double the height of the clutter or the foliage is certainly a nice beneficial height to install equipment for.
And another question, what do you provide or recommend for lawful intercept, for example, CALEA?
We've worked with some third parties in that regard, so it's feasible. It's kind of a one-off solution that we would generally look at the requirements and so forth, but in order to do so, there are interfaces that we need to enable to a third-party solution, which we've done in the past.
Very good. I'm going to cover this slide, and then for those of you that have to go, let you go. I will continue on with the presentation, but I know we're getting to the bottom of the hour. People talk about 5G and they said, what about 5G? How do I factor 5G in? If you look on the left, what I did is I took a couple of pictures off the internet, and you look at on the right-hand side, it says 3GPP. 3GPP is third generation partnership project, which is the mobile operators, and it's the standards that they develop to advance from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G. So LTE is 4G. So if you look at it, release 10, 11, 12, 13, etc., and you see down below it, you've gone from LTE to, at certain releases, LTE Advanced, and then you have LTE Advanced version B and LTE Advanced version C. The reason you have the versions B and C is because you can't do it all at once. So it's just a timing issue. If you look up above that, you see that 5G prototyping and research is done in parallel. It's part of the standards, and that's the point I'm trying to make. 5G is not different standards, it's addition to the standards. And just like you went from 3G to 4G, you have overlap of what's happening in 3G simultaneously with what happened with LTE. This is no different. So if you're worrying about, gee, do we wait for 5G? Absolutely not, because it's all part of one standard. And depending on what piece of 5G you want to get out of it, IoT, or are you looking at it because of the higher bands that will be supported? Or are you looking at it because of the different modulation scheme? That stuff will take a longer period of time to come to fruition. The bottom part, the ITU, for those of you that are not familiar, that's the International Standards Organization for Communications. And if you've been around long enough, it used to be called CCITT, which was a French acronym. And they used to do the books as the orange book. So every 4 years, you have the orange books, and then you have the yellow books, and you have the red books, and so on. The right-hand side hopefully adds to the figure on the left to show you that if you look at it, you see LTE, and here it's LTE Advanced Pro. So you go LTE, LTE Advanced Pro, branding, all the way up to 5G. So they've got their timeline. And again, if you look down there, this particular graphic, they were trying to point out when 5G was coming and in what phases. But in those releases are the LTE specs that they continue to evolve, right? So there's that crossover. So overlap at every G, as I call it. So hopefully that helps clarify that no one's going to miss the boat on 5G, that it evolves right along with everything else. And there's, of course, new frequencies that are very, very high frequency. So those are specialized applications or urban areas. And then there's going to be things built in for lower latency with the driverless cars, and so on and so forth. So there's many more applications and looking at supporting many more devices. So how about if I answer any questions for people that need to leave, and then I'll continue on. And continuing on, I've got about, I think, 5 or 6 slides left.
So we do have one question. Do you have link budgets for the different frequencies?
We absolutely do. I think that would be something I suggest we schedule a dedicated session, and we can hand you our planning assumptions and so forth, and we can even model for you and work with your radio network planners. We have those capabilities and those expertise in house to work hand in hand and help you with business model and so forth.
Great.
What is the effect of the high frequency on humans?
You know, in general, that's a concern of a certain demographic. It's not been proven, and there's a lot of speculation on that matter. RF in general will increase your body temperature ever so slightly, and that's really all that's been proven. And that's under the assumption of direct exposure, meaning several feet from a high power transmitter.
We never recommend that. So I'll cover the rest of the slides. This one really talks about the higher market share per tower, leveraging capital efficiently. So for those of you looking at the business case for an LTE product and one that's a software-defined radio where you can add capacity and has the flexibility, means that the product stays on the tower longer. I talked to one customer in Texas and I said, you know, we're looking to tell operators they'll get 5 to 6 years as opposed to the 3 years we hear about for proprietary Wi-Fi based products. He said, I'm actually right now projected to get 8 or 9 years. So everyone's situation can be slightly different. It depends on your user base, what you're doing, how you're pricing it to hold back some of the demand in terms of how much bandwidth they'll use. But when you look at the business case, it's a business case based on return on investment, not on the purchase price of the equipment. If you look at the things that say, well, why would I pick a Telrad product versus anyone else's product? There's a couple key things. Number one, like I said, LTE standard does not address layer 2. Layer 2 is needed for business customers. It could be important for gamers, businesses, any types of things that are specialized deployment for multiple locations, or what of your customers might be doing that is unique. 3GPP does not truly define static IP. So again, the things that Telrad has to do is to provide all those capabilities that make your network, not just your RF link, but your network work the way you want it to work to serve your particular customers. In this case, a customer may want to eliminate leased lines, and for that they need layer 2 to do the network extension. Some of the big operators we have, so we're well into deployments and large numbers and growth scenarios, so we have lots and lots of instances of success with customers, all of them still in business. So that's something else that we take into effect, and we can get people that need to talk to some of our customers that opportunity. This is one of my favorite slides. This demonstrates the flexibility of our 4x4 radio deployed in different ways. And you can pay for what you use to get started and grow from there. So scenario 1, upper left, is if I just needed a low density deployment, I still get 100 megabits with 20 megahertz of spectrum, but I may only need a 2x2 situation. And so I can do that and start cost effectively. Then I can move to a 2 or a 3. In a lot of cases, 3 would be preferred over 2. 2 is kind of the poor man's variety, but 3 with the dual sector, dual carrier capability, I can focus those 2 sectors on different locations using one radio. Each one of them is using a 2x2 antenna arrangement, and run a business that way until I get additional customers to subscribe, where then all of a sudden I need to do one of these 3 things on the bottom. So if I'm in a treed environment, I will probably buy and use the radio in 4x4 transmit mode configuration to get the maximum non-line of sight penetration. Number 5 is if I'm competing and have to have the highest peak rate, then I can do carrier aggregation for that 40 megahertz to get 200 megabits per second. That's a cumulative channel, right? You're going to break some of that up as up and down. downlink and uplink. And then number 6, here's where Nick was talking about the multi-user MIMO. It doesn't increase your top end speed, but it allows you or enables you to serve more customers in that sector with the same radio. Now, theoretically, they talk about it doubling the spectral efficiency at 10 bits per hertz. In reality, it depends on where your customers are physically. So you could get 40%, 50%, 60%. It all depends, but you will not get 100%. But just know that's what everybody talks about is usually the theoretical max, because otherwise it depends. If I look at the entire portfolio, I want to draw your attention to the upper right. So something else that Telrad has spent a lot of time and energy on is the network management and performance and subscriber management. So Wi-Fi based systems, including the Wi-Fi I have in my house, I can get into it, I can look at it, I can see what the end user devices are doing, no problem. Surprisingly, because LTE is a layer 3 technology, you don't have that capability out of the box. And so Telrad wrote all of the software to be able to give operators the visibility down to the CPE level, which means better troubleshooting, understanding what's going on when a customer calls in, reducing or eliminate truck rolls. And what that means is we had to bridge between layer 2 and layer 3 to do it. So again, the performance of the radio is fantastic because it's purpose built. We did our own silicon, but that's just a piece of it, having a good RF link. The other is all the things that you painfully go through to operate and manage a network. And people talk about the upfront cost, but most of us know that operationally, if you don't have the right tools, it can be like a leaky bucket for your cash flow. So all the parts are here. Nick and his team can give you all the information in terms of your options and what we can integrate with, but it's a full-blown solution end to end. And the other attribute of Telrad, we work with every customer till we get them online. So we've had to fly people out and land them in sites. And when I talked to someone at one of the recent shows, they said, you know what, there's a lot of people out there, but what Telrad does really well is you stick with the customer and get them on the air. And Nick Dewar and his team are the ones responsible for that, and kudos to them. How to get started with Telrad. So 2 more slides for those of you that are able to stick with us. Most of you have, so thank you. We have partners, so we increase our partners. So Wave is now a distributor as well as Tesco. So those are the recent additions. PCS is with us as well as Double Radius and others. So we've had a good stable of partners. And if you want to share a problem or an opportunity, you can contact me. I'm head of marketing. Dory and I are the marketing team essentially. And you can contact me at tom.gruba@telrad.com. Mike Cook, who joined us 4 or 5 months ago, is the VP of North America Sales. His email is there. And the kind of discussions we want to have is when you're evaluating the business case, the impact on doing the evaluation as an ROI, looking at what you're thinking about for deployment options, where we then pull in Nick and someone from his team, looking at it holistically, so all the way from an end-to-end solution. We like to understand that best because there's so much that we know about networking and operating a network that goes beyond just the air interface. So if you want to spend a day with us, we do road shows. Dory has all of these industry events and others on our website. It's telrad.com/events. So we'd love for that. We go through things in detail. Nick gives a great 1.5-hour presentation on the technology. I cover a lot of what we covered today, but from adding to the business side, the business reasons. You can buy a starter kit, which is a way to get up and running and test the technology. But again, you need that fundamental understanding of how LTE works, which is why we not only do a training class, that's a 3-day training class, and there is a fee for that. I'll tell you up front, you want to provide good training, it does cost money, as well as Nick does a webinar every 2 weeks that talks about the technology. And then of course, talking with any of our successful customers, any of our customers, I should say, they're all successful, is another way to get started. Where to find us? So we put the webinar, I should say, Dory and her team put the webinars on YouTube. this was the webinar this week. The time was wrong there for some reason. And if you have input and you want to know additional topics, then please let us know. I'm always happy to adjust to create new webinars. And here are the events that we're going to be at. So whip out your cell phone, take a picture. I learned a lot from talking to people in Des Moines. It was a wonderful conference. WISP America was great. The next shows coming up are going to be NTCA IP Vision in New Orleans. I will be there speaking on a panel. And then we'll be at all the NTCA regional events that are in July and August of this year. So we'll have sales folks at those. I hope to attend a couple of them. And then, of course, WISPAPalooza, which is in Las Vegas, October 8th to 12th. So, Dory, let's see if there's any remaining questions. And I really appreciate everyone's time and coming. And again, if you've got questions or we weren't clear on something, please send me an email.
Yeah, there are several questions already, but if you don't mind, I'd like to run one last poll just for people who are interested in a trial kit. I'm going to launch that poll now. Anybody who's interested in doing that, if you just click yes here, it'll let us know to have someone contact you right away to arrange that and just cut out a step for you having to reach out to one of our salespeople directly. Okay, so let me get going with the questions while that's up and running. Given the frequencies are very high, would you have a single CPE for an apartment building, or would you have to have several?
Multi-band CPEs are something that are starting to make their way into the market, although they'll come at a price point that would be higher than the single band products that are available today. In fact, all deployments as of today are on a per subscriber level working with a single band. That doesn't mean that fixed wireless providers aren't deploying only one band. They're deploying a multi-band strategies, but connecting subscribers with the spectrum band that is most relevant for the link conditions to that individual subscriber, whether it be 2.5, 3.65, or 5 gigahertz.
Sorry about that.
And so one of the other underlying themes of that question could be, can I bring capacity into an apartment building and then distribute the capacity inside? Sure, you could. Would you want people to sign up individually and put their own CPE on an apartment building? That might be tough depending on where that apartment building is, but that could be done as well. And that's going to be between the owner of the building and the people that run the apartment and things like that. So there's a couple different ways that could be done to deliver the amount of capacity you need.
Okay, does this require a core to manage users' accounts?
We have a very flexible architecture option in terms of the core. First of all, we have an embedded Evolve Packet Core solution, which would be built into the eNodeB, into the base station itself. So the core would be just software present at the edge of the network at the subscriber level. Alternatively, we have a centralized appliance option where you can pull all traffic to a centralized aggregation point and then impose things such as high availability or geo-redundancy. From a provisioning point of view, everything comes back. Our model is built based on pay per subscriber, so it's very, very easy to pay as you grow. And that includes all of the core components, so there's really no hidden cost. In that model, the network management platform will be included. It's called BreezeView. It has a REST API, which could interface with any billing platform or backend OSS for purpose of provisioning. Or alternatively, you could do the end user provisioning directly in the NMS itself. The key is that that would be a manual method versus the automated API method.
Okay. For configurations that you had a couple slides back, were those using only one base station?
Yes, and that was the point. That's exactly right. So I've pulled it back up, and that is using one compact and using it in any of these ways. And as you grow your network, you would put in, a second, a third, or a fourth, right? So you can put in as you need capacity, continue to add radios. And as Nick was talking about, we've got flexible ways, very creative ways of dealing with the Evolve Packet Core. So that's either built into the radio, or you could put one at the base of the tower, or you could have one all the way back in your central office, or you can do a combination of the above.
Thank you. What is included in the starter kit?
The starter kit generally has, I don't know if you have a BOM there, but in general it has the embedded evolved packet core, an access point or a base station essentially, with antenna, cabling, power supply, power cable, I think 5 subscriber units. So it's really everything you need to go out and install 5 test subscribers and evaluate the product, with the exception of routing and switching and backhaul.
Great question.
What do you feel is the average max range for a Telrad 3.5 LTE system?
I think if we took an average throughout the U.S., it might be somewhere around 5 to 7 miles. That said, there's some ranges which are upwards to 20 plus miles, and there's others which are 2-3 miles or less. So it really does depend on the terrain, the attachment height, the clutter. There's just a lot of variables. So we do have a very wide range of serviceable coverage areas.
And Nick, that would be totally different if it's non-line of sight versus non-line of sight, or is it the same?
Yeah, if you have line of sight, then you can do max modulation outwards beyond 20 kilometers in 365.
Does your product support 700 megahertz?
It does not, no.
Okay, I think we've reached the last of our questions.
Terrific.
Here's another one. Future reference, as a Telrad operator, you might want to account for that in your polls. Oh, I guess this is just one for us.
Okay.
Okay. That was just a suggestion for polls. No problem. We're good.
Okay. I want to thank you all and thank Steve Coran for joining us today. And again, like I said, if you've got suggestions, improvements, if we're not clear, send us a note. And if not, get to one of our road shows or meet us at a trade show. And for those of you that want to be contacted right away, we'll get to our sales team. We've got a great sales team. They're all wonderful people. And we'll get you started on your way to evaluation.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here, and thanks to Tom, Nick, and Steve for their time. We will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the presentation, and we also have a short survey that is going to launch as soon as I end the webinar. We really would appreciate you completing it to help us improve. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Bye-bye.